Hi, this is Steve Platek for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. Today, we're very fortunate to have Professor Gad Saad. He's a professor of marketing at Concordia University. He's Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption. And he's author of several well-known books, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption and The Consuming Instinct. Hi, Gad. How you doing?
Hey, Stephen. Good to be with you.
All right. So the question that I ask my interviewees typically first is, how did you become interested in evolutionary science or the evolutionary perspective, especially as a professor of business?
Right. So it was first semester 1990 in fall. I had enrolled at Cornell University to precisely study consumer psychology. I took an advanced social psychology course with a gentleman by the name of Dennis Regan. So the course wasn't an evolutionary psychology course, but halfway through the semester, he assigned the famous book by Daly and Wilson, Homicide. And so I read that book, and right there, my epiphany had happened. I saw the elegance, the explanatory power, the parsimony that is afforded via EP to explain an incredibly wide range of, criminal behaviors across widely different cultures. And so that was it. I was bitten by the bug. Regrettably, or perhaps not regrettably, but the reality was that not too many consumer psychologists then and even now were really into evolutionary psychology. So it's only when I then moved on to assume an assistant professorship that I then started applying it in consumer behavior.
Excellent. So, with respect to applying it to consumer behavior, I recently did some podcasts with officers of the Applied Evolutionary Psychology Society, and they put you out there as a driving, leading force in application of evolutionary psychology, and I concur. I think that's great. How do you apply evolutionary science to the consumer or the environment of consumption?
Right, that's a great question. So, to kind of contextualize my answer, let me first say that most people who study consumer behavior could come from very different backgrounds. They could be social psychologists or trained in social psychology or cognitive psychology, or they could be cultural anthropologists or sociologists or postmodernists. But what they all have in common is that they abdicate biology as relevant in explaining consumer behavior. And the general argument has been, although again things are slowly changing, that what makes us humans and consumers in particular is that we transcend our biology. Yes, biology is important to explain the behavior of the mosquito and the elephant and the lion, but when it comes to humans, of course, evolution stops at the head. And so consumption is about understanding the socialization forces that make us the consumers that we eventually become. And so that's kind of the background to, if you'd like, the hostility that I have faced in my career. So you apply it in many ways. I mean, why is it that men are more likely to succumb to pathological gambling or are more likely to be interested in pornography? How does gift giving and the consumption ritual manifest itself? That, of course, is very much driven by kin selection and reciprocity. What kinds of products do we use as sexual signals? In the same way that the peacock uses his tail, men and women use certain products to position themselves in a nice and a good light on the mating market. So everything that we do, from the foods that we eat to the songs that we listen to the movies that tickle our fancy, all of these things are ultimately part of our consumatory nature.
Wow. So I have obviously a ton of questions here. One is, can you elaborate a little bit more on, you said hostility. A couple years ago, some students, I was a student at the time, we wrote a paper about what it's like to have that, what we call the scarlet letter of EP. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and like yourself in consumer sciences, there's not a lot of cognitive neuroscientists out there that are studying evolved cognitive mechanisms, right? And sometimes when if I say go for a job interview or I go for a talk and they realize that I'm an evolutionary cognitive neuroscience, I kind of get that look of, oh, brother. Right? Yeah, here we go again. Another story. What has your experience been in the consumer? Because, I mean, consumers is big bucks, right? I mean, cognitive neuroscience is just brain imaging. So,
well, interestingly, practitioners, so marketers out in industry, not academics, not scientists, are a lot more, have been a lot more open to my work, because ultimately they're Darwinian beings. They don't have a paradigm to defend, and they're willing to listen to anything that says, hey, this will help you understand consumption in a more complete manner. I think the problem with consumer scholars has been, and I think that itself is part of human nature, once you are vested in a paradigm, it becomes very, very difficult to move people away from that paradigm. Even though I've repeatedly explained to them that if I am right, it doesn't mean that you're wrong, right? The old proximate ultimate story. You could propose all sorts of proximate mechanisms that are perfectly correct, and then I could come with some ultimate explanations that do nothing but complement your correct theory. So it need not be a confrontational endeavor. Rather, your theories in the proximate world and my theories in the ultimate world will help us understand consumption better. That said, it's been very difficult for them to accept that message. So several years ago, I went to a very, very prestigious university where I literally wasn't able to finish a single sentence during my talk. I had probably about 30 slides. I was talking about my first book, my 2007 book, and I probably got through maybe 7 or 8 slides. After the talk, the doctoral students came up to me to apologize for the behaviors of their supervisors. And of course, what ended up happening, as you might imagine, is that the doctoral students are open to new ideas, again, because they're not vested. The senior folks are, wait a second, if this guy's right, I'm screwed, let's kill him.
Now, I bet you, I don't probably have as much money as you do, but I would bet you a few American dollars, whatever that's worth, that most of the people that have this complex are male. Because it turns out, well, I mean, it turns out that in the academic scholarly world, males are overrepresented anyway, but it's a dominance thing, right? If I come up with a theory of, Steve's theory of enter some behavior, and you come along, or an evolutionary science comes along and says, yeah, okay, that's great, but hey, there's this other thing that controls the rest of nature. Wow, I've just been knocked down a peg, right?
Absolutely. I mean, in my first book, I have a quote from Paul Meehl, who's a very famous psychologist, and I hope I'm quoting his exact words. He says, ethology rules academe.
Yeah.
In other words, ultimately, the mechanisms that we are all familiar with, at least evolutionary psychologists are very much at the forefront of all the dynamics that happen in academia. Although I would say that it's not just, I mean, you're right about the male and the dominance, but a lot of women are also very hostile to my theories for reasons that you might suspect. So, because if you argue that there are innate sex differences, then you're a rabid sexist and so on. And so I've had a lot of hostility from women for those reasons.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about, because I am deeply interested in sex differences, and I believe in sex differences. I mean, not that it's something to believe in, but I think that I'm getting my point across. Tell me about female consumption behavior and how it differs from male consumer behavior.
Right. So 99% of Ferrari owners in North America are male, notwithstanding the fact that there are tons of millionaire and billionaire women who otherwise could afford it. So the argument that there is an economic barrier to entry simply could not hold true, because we know that there are tons of women that could afford them, yet they're not lining up to buy the Aston Martins and the Ferraris.
Right.
So there are a bunch of sex-specific products that are almost exclusively purchased by either men or women, and that holds true whether it's in Romania or in Atlanta or in Montreal or 200 years ago or 400 years from now. In other words, it transcends time and place. So in the case of women, so I did a recent study where I looked with one of my doctoral students where we looked at the menstrual cycle and its effect on consumer behavior. Specifically, we looked at food and sexual signaling, beautification. And of course, women's behaviors were very, very much driven by these hormonal fluctuations, so that depending on whether they were in the luteal, non-fertile phase or the fertile phase, they either spent more time engaging in sexual signaling or more time engaging in food foraging. Exactly as you might predict from an evolutionary perspective, and precisely the type of hypothesis that you could have never generated had you not come with an evolutionary lens to the table.
Right. Yeah. So what kind of cars do women drive?
Well, I think all sorts of cars for all sorts of different reasons, depending on which life cycle stage they're at.
Okay.
But I think what is clear is that they're not lining up to purchase the really luxurious, exotic sports cars.
Right.
And again, that doesn't mean that there isn't a single woman who does that, which leads me to an interesting point. One of the biggest challenges I have found so far with evolutionary psychology is that if you propose a theory that should hold true at the population level, and then somebody comes up with a datum at the individual level that seems to be contrary to that, they think suddenly that the whole Darwinian edifice has fallen apart. So if you say that men are taller than women, that is an absolute biological fact. However, every single woman in the WNBA is taller than most men who walk around on Earth today. Yeah. And that doesn't invalidate the fact that at the population level. So I think that's been a huge challenge. If you say that men are attracted more to young women than postmenopausal women, then somebody will raise their hand and say, yeah, but my uncle is dating Jenny, who is 58,
right,
and so on and so forth. So I think that's been a big challenge. And I think, as evolutionary psychologists, we need to get the point across regarding this particular cognitive trap.
Yeah, this idea that the public doesn't necessarily understand statistics and what an outlier in statistical evidence is, right? I always get, when I talk about sex differences in attraction, I always get the student who raises their hand and says, well, what about the Cougar effect? And you think, oh, yeah, I mean, okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, all right, let me ask you a couple of other questions. One is applied evolutionary psychology. I mean, you are an applied evolutionary psychologist. What do you think about that discipline? It's a fairly young discipline, sub-discipline right now. Where do you see the future of that discipline?
I think it's infinite in the sense that are you there?
Oh, I'm here. Yeah.
It just, the screen went blank for a second.
Okay.
If you go to an HBEST conference or the premier journal, Evolutionary Human Behavior, of course, every single paper is gorgeous, interesting, rigorous, but you end up, if I may say, kind of covering roughly the same set. If we came up with a content analysis, we come up with roughly a pretty standard set of issues, facial symmetry and so on and so forth, which is great. And I think we've really nailed these mechanisms and these phenomena. But I think the next step is to now use that universal key that is afforded by evolutionary psychology or evolutionary theory in general and go into uncharted territories, whether it be what I do for the past 15 years, consumer behavior and business sciences, or Darwinian law, or evolutionary architecture, Darwinian gastronomy, biopolitics. Each of these fields are applying evolutionary principles and biological formalisms in completely different areas. But what's common to all these areas is that they involve biological organisms called humans, and hence it doesn't make sense that you would somehow completely negate the role of biology and evolutionary theory in these fields. So to answer your question, I hope I'm not too long-winded away, it's everything is up for grabs. Everything is open. That's why it's so exciting. You could do anything with evolutionary theory across endless applied settings.
Wow, that's awesome. Darwinian gastronomy. I've never heard of it called that, but I love it. I mean, that's what we eat at I assume that's something along the lines of eating like a Paleolithic primal diet.
Go ahead.
But it might also involve things like Darwinian mechanisms to get people to buy food, like in a pub or something.
I mean, sure, it could be those things, but that's not what the official definition is.
Oh, really? What is it?
But nice shot. It's actually a guy by the name of Paul Sherman, who's a neuroscientist at Cornell, at my alma mater. Do you know who Sherman is? Are you familiar?
Yeah. I know his work very well.
Oh, good. And so I'm actually going back to my alma mater to speak on the consuming instinct next month. Hopefully I'll get a chance to meet him. So what Paul has done with several colleagues, and hence he's the guy who coined the term Darwinian gastronomy, is look at cross-cultural differences in culinary traditions, whether it be how much meat versus vegetable-based dishes there are in that tradition, how much spices are used in that tradition. It could be extended to the extent to which pickling happens or smoking happens, how much salt consumption occurs in that culture. And it turns out that all of these cross-cultural differences are related to something called the antimicrobial hypothesis, which of course relates to how likely are you to be exposed to pathogens that are born from foods. And so then these culinary traditions end up being cultural adaptations to important biological problems. And I use this example as a very powerful way to demonstrate how culture itself is within the purview of biology, right? Or
I love it.
so that's what Darwinian gastronomy is.
I love it. As I indicated earlier, I was just talking with Jerry Coyne, and we talked about culture and how culture is something that is a product of the biological process. That's outstanding. Okay, I have two more questions for you, and then I'll let you get back to work. The first question is, if humans, and I believe this, and obviously I think most evolutionary scientists do, if humans are consuming and buying things based upon evolutionarily old mechanisms or new mechanisms, whatever it may be, evolutionarily derived mechanisms, what kind of reaction do you think you might get in say America, where the American political system right now is sort of tilted against evolution, and especially with our upcoming elections and that sort of thing? Do you anticipate your work experience any kind of additional hostility? Because it's people are going to misconstrue it as genetic determinism.
Of course. Look, the interesting thing about evolutionary theory is that people on the left could attack it, and then of course people on the right could attack it, right? So the people on the right attack it as a atheist conspiracy to remove God from the universe. People on the left, so historically, Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould, somehow think that since it doesn't fit with their Marxist pet theories, then it must be some evil conspiracy. So the reality is that I don't think there is a monopoly in terms of the right versus the left and hating evolutionary theory. I think what's exciting about evolutionary theory, other than the fact that it is true, is that it pushes so many buttons of so many people who hold their particular pet ideology. So if I'm a radical feminist, I hate evolutionary theory because it says that there are innate sex differences. If I am a postmodernist, I hate evolutionary theory because, of course, there are human universals, and so on and so forth. So I think whether it's the left or the right, there's always going to be haters of evolutionary theory.
I like it. That's a great answer. My last question for you,
Sure.
Since I'm talking to the premier applied evolutionary psychologist on the planet, what could you tell people to buy as gifts to maximize their reproductive success?
Well, let's put it this way: if you're on a first date, make sure not to be cheap on your first date, because there will never be a second date. And again, this doesn't mean that the woman doesn't have enough money to buy her own meal and so on, but frugality in the mating market, and certainly when you're starting the courting process, is a terribly unattractive quality in men. And any woman who tells you otherwise is lying to you. So that would be one. Of course, there's all kinds of other cases. Engagement rings, right? The whole ritual of engagement rings it's a costly signal. In this case, literally associated to finance, right?
That's right.
You have to spend 25% of your yearly income on that rock, precisely because that's the costly signal that will differentiate you from the pretenders. Right, yeah. And that's why part of the subtitle of my book is what gift giving reveals about human nature. Because whether it be the gifts that you give to your children, and hence that's part of parental investment, or the gifts that you give part of the mating market, or the gifts that you give to friends, right? So I might invite you on your birthday, and then you reciprocate when it's my birthday. The fact that we keep these reciprocal arrangements in our heads ultimately oils our relationship. And so gift giving is really an important consumatory context to study all of these Darwinian mechanisms.
Fantastic. Well, Gad, thank you so much for being with me. If people want to learn more about your work and what you do, they can check out your blog. What is the URL for that?
So they could check out my blog. Do you want me to look it up?
Actually, I can get it posted on the video
okay.
afterwards. So
my blog, Psychology Today, Homo Consumericus is the name of the blog. And they could go to my personal website, which is also titled Homo Consumericus, and they could see, all my work and certain interviews and so on and so forth.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much, Steve. Good to see you. Ciao.